In part 1 of what happened to the tribe of Dan, we dealt biblically with their origin, starting with the original man named Dan himself. Some of the things that the tribe of Dan ended up doing eventually, and the ultimate act of idolatry once the kingdom split. In this second half, we're going to dive even deeper into where they may have went, who may have been influenced by them, and more importantly, why they are not in the book of Revelations counted as one of the 144,000 that are sealed. Now we know that a good portion of the tribe ended up going up north to settle in a town known as Laish, which David named Dan. However, there was a remnant of the tribe that stayed in the original territory on the west coast of Israel. And you can read about them being scolded by Deborah in the book of Judges when there was a big battle. The Danites did not help. As a matter of fact, she says that they stayed on their ships as aliens.
Gilead remained beyond the Jordan, and why did Dan live as an alien on ships? Asher sat still on the sea coast and remained by its landings. These did not come to battle for God's people.
This perhaps is one of the biggest clues letting us know that Dan had not only traveled on foot to go to the new territory up north, a good deal of their tribe were actually dealing with ships. And this is going to be important a little later. Not just them, but Asher had also become seafaring as well. Mind you, these people are living on the coast. And one may be asking themselves, well, we were not originally coastal people. Our founder left from the land of Ur, the Chaldeans, which is an area that is typically landlocked. Of course, you got the Euphrates River, but there's no major oceans or seas around that area. Then we leave, we go into the land of Canaan, and then from the land of Canaan, we end up in Egypt. And then from Egypt, we leave there and go into the wilderness for 40 years. All of this is dealing with us being on land. How would Dan and Asher become seafaring, knowing one, how to build ships and how to navigate the waters? And in order to answer that, you have to look at the people who were there before the Israelites got there. The people known as the Phoenicians were really the Sidonians, and you could read about them in Genesis. They come from a man named Sidon, who is a Canaanite. That means that these people are the Hamites, or what we know as African. Well, they lived there, and they are seafaring. As a matter of fact, Jezebel was from the Phoenicians or the Sidonians, and they lived on the coast. One of the major attributes of the Phoenicians or the Sidonians is that any place they conduct trade, they typically set up a colony, which ends up becoming a little mini empire. One of the most infamous one is that known of Carthage, which is not in Israel, but in Africa. Carthage gave way to one of the world's greatest generals, a man named Hannibal. And Hannibal was the man who almost defeated the powerful empire of Rome. He marched elephants into Europe, straight into the heart of Rome. These were Carthaginians who were Phoenician, which is really Sidonian, which are really Hamites, which are really African people. I hope you're following it.
The Phoenicians, though, probably thought of themselves as descendants of the Canaanite peoples of the Bronze Age. After all, they had much in common with their Canaanite ancestors. They more or less spoke a version of the same language, worshipped many, if not all of the same gods and goddesses, and as far as we know, maintained many aspects of the same culture.
And it seems the Danites would have learned maybe a trade or a trick or two from these same people.
The most prominent Phoenician cities were Byblos, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Arvad. Being coastal cities and lucrative trade hubs, Phoenicia attracted many different peoples from all parts of the world.
Not only that, but you also have the Philistines, who are not from Ham. They would be more related to Japheth, Noah's other son.
One such group were the infamous Sea Peoples, who according to Egyptian, Ugaritic, Cypriot, and other textual sources, ravaged the area and brought about what historians today refer to as the Bronze Age collapse of 1200 to 1150 BCE, which at least with regard to the Levant, brought about the end of Egyptian, Assyrian, and Hittite domination of the region. Egypt lost its empire in Asia, which was mostly in Canaan, and the Assyrians lost their connection to the Levant's lucrative trade with northern Mesopotamia. The Hittites, though, suffered the most, as their state was completely wiped off the map. Gone, finished, never to arise again. In place of these great powers, new political entities arose in the Levant, including Neo-Hittite, Aramaean, and other kingdoms such as Israel, Judah, Edom, Moab, and the Philistine states.
However, they are known as the Peleset of the Sea People, and they live right there on the coast. They had 5 major cities that were set up that we were told to get rid of, and of course we never did. All of these people would go on to play a major influence on those tribes that lived around those coastal areas. Keep in mind that these tribes were under the heavy influence of the marine kingdom and all the spirits that dwell within, because that is the spirit of the merchant. And it is most likely that the tribes living on the coast would have learned how to navigate the seas by the very people we were told to get rid of. Referencing really quickly back to the Phoenicians, we know that eventually the Israelites ended up merging empires, almost synonymously with the Phoenicians. This alliance reached its height during the time of King David and King Solomon. We knew that King David and the king of Tyre were good friends at the time, and then when David died, the king of Tyre, his name is Hiram, ends up helping David's son Solomon to build the temple of Yahweh. He not only helps him to acquire some of the raw material needed, but also sends men to aid in the labor. But as we can see throughout the scripture, Solomon was not happy with just being a powerful land empire. He wanted to expand to the seas. So what does he do? He enlists the help of the seafaring people, the Phoenicians, who at this time are ahead of the Greeks, and this is after the Egyptians had fell off. They are the predominant power in the known sea. So not only does Solomon get help from sea people, he gets help from the best of the sea people. In 1 Kings, we read about the fleet that he built down by the Red Sea, where we crossed, leaving Egypt.
King Solomon also built ships at Ezion-Geber, which is near Elath in Edom, on the shore of the Red Sea. And Hiram sent his men, sailors who knew the sea, to serve in the fleet with Solomon's men. They sailed to Ophir and brought back 420 talents of gold, which they delivered to King Solomon.
Mr. Ron Wyatt.
Yeah,
essentially.
And Solomon, who erected it to start with.
Of course, yeah.
So, the matching column on the Saudi Arabian side had Hebrew writing on it still, when Ron found it in 1984, that said Solomon, Pharaoh, Yahweh, death, Mizraim, which means Egypt, water, Edom. So this was a marker marking the Red Sea crossing spot.
And someone has made their own markings on it,
yes,
apparently.
Unfortunately, but modern graffiti. But Solomon's seaport, Elath, was 50 miles to the north there at modern-day Eilat. And so Solomon, this was his area, this was his neighborhood. And so 400 years after the fact, he had these columns erected to mark the spot of the Red Sea crossing. He knew full well where this event took place.
So that must have been passed down from family to family.
Yeah, sure.
Yep.
So it's a 16-foot red granite Phoenician-style column. Beautiful.
And there's obviously no writing on there. That's all been washed off now.
The back side of it has been eroded away. It doesn't look this nice, and that's where probably some writing was.
But that's a solid piece of granite. That's not like the Sodom and Gomorrah limestone that we saw. This is
right.
This
is very solid red granite. It's very beautiful. So from here, we can get a look at where this is in relation to the water. It's set back. The water's a couple hundred yards away.
And this is the beach here, essentially.
Yeah, this is the crossing area right here where the water actually opened up.
Wow.
Yes. It's amazing to stand here.
Did you know that in 1979 a huge column was discovered on the south end of Nuweiba Beach, and then another in 1983 on the opposite side of the sea? These columns are made out of solid granite and were 6 meters tall. The column on the Saudi side has the words written on it saying Mizraim, which the Hebrews called Egypt, Solomon, Edom, Death, Pharaoh, Moses, and Yahweh. These columns are believed to have been put up by King Solomon himself to remember the site of the Red Sea crossing.
In 1 Kings 9:26, Yam Suf refers again to the northern tip of the Aqaba finger of the Red Sea, and is where Solomon had a fleet of ships stationed at Eloth, which is modern-day Eilat.
Now, as we said in the previous video, the kingdom of Israel split. The 12 tribes were united with King David, but after his son King Solomon died, the empire split, and the northern half seemed to become wayward way quicker than the southern half. And in 722 BC, the Assyrians came and scattered them abroad after they took over the region. But here's where things get interesting, however. Some theologians claim that the tribe of Dan had already started to migrate out of the land of Israel before the 722 Assyrian conquest, while others claim that the tribe itself stayed there very much so and partook in the exilement among other tribes in the northern half. And the biggest account comes from a man from Ethiopia named Eldad the Danite.
Louise Ginsburg in Legends of the Jews speaks of Eldad bin Mali Hadan of the 9th century, better known as Eldad the Danite. Ginsburg speaks of the division of Israel through Eldad's account of Jeroboam after his return from Egypt and how Jeroboam and the elders wanted to have the warrior tribe of Dan to attack the other 10 tribes, and Dan refuses and actually threatens to attack Jeroboam. Eldad says instead they left the promised land by way of Egypt. Eldad speaks of 3 ways Jews and Israelites made their way to Ethiopia and the Sudan.
This is one of the most credible sources of us seeing remnants of Dan and where they may have went. And for people who shrug their shoulders at the fact that Israelites would have made their way to a place in Africa, you have to keep in mind that the sons of Ham and the sons of Shem had always been dealing with each other. There were 3 sons from Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The Japhethites we know became the Europeans and the Eastern Mongoloid people. Ham became the progenitors of all of Africa, and Shem became the progenitor of all the Shemites, which would involve the Hebrew people, dealing with the 12 tribes. When Joseph is told to take baby Yeshua out of the land of Israel to escape King Herod and the slaughter of the innocents, where does he go? He goes to Egypt. He went out to Egypt to hide. They went to hide there because they looked like the Egyptians. We read in the New Testament that Paul himself, who all the Christians project as a white European Christian, was actually a black Hebrew from the tribe of Benjamin, and the fact that he was mistaken for an Egyptian who at that time predominantly was still melanated before the Arab conquest. We see that Moses was taken and raised in Pharaoh's court in his home, and they couldn't tell the difference between him and them, because if you judge a book by its cover and that cover is the skin color, then we all are the same, but that's not the case. Just because our skin color may be the same, we are different people. Furthermore, when Moses asks the Most High for a sign to show that he is with him when he goes before the people, Moses is told to put his hand in his coat, and when he pulls it back out, it's white with leprosy. Moses freaks out. The Most High tells him to put his hand back in his coat, and when he pulls it back out, his original melanated skin is back. We always went to Africa to hide out because, for the most part, we blended in. You need to know that because when we're dealing with the tribe of Dan, it is highly logical to believe that that would have been one of the first places that they would have went to in a time of distress or in a time of disagreement. What also was so funny is that in Ethiopia, which was known as Cush back then, there are a tribe of Hebrew Israelites known as the Phoenicia. And while the Jewish people would call them lost Jews, they're not Jews. Unless you are from the tribe of Judah, you are not a Jew. As a matter of fact, the Phoenicians don't claim to be Jews. The Phoenicians say that they are from the tribe of Dan.
The Beta Israel, the Jewish lost tribe of Dan in Ethiopia, also known as Ethiopian Jews, have resided in Ethiopia for centuries. They have a unique religious and cultural identity, combining elements of Judaism with Ethiopian tradition. In the late 20th century, a significant number of Beta Israel members immigrated to Israel under the law of return. Ethiopian Jews are considered one of the oldest diaspora Jewish communities, with references to Jews in Ethiopia found in biblical scriptures. Genetic studies have suggested a genetic connection between the Beta Israel and other Jewish populations.
Going back into what Eldad was saying about where they went, also I want you to know that the Phoenicians speak Hebrew and they keep the 7-day Sabbath. Another name for the Phoenicians would be Beta Israel, meaning the house of Israel, because they are one of the remnants of a tribe that made up the entire house of Israel. You may be wondering, what does the word Phoenicia mean? It is the Amharic word for landless or wandering. Because again, we lost our land, and as a result, we lost our heritage and our culture. But more on that later. So are the Phoenicians still in Ethiopia? Well, some are. But in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, a lot of them petitioned to go back to Israel. Here's the problem. If it was the Most High who overseen the removal of us from the land which He promised us, then it needs to be the Most High who reignites us coming back. Not only that, but we no longer possess that land. That land right now, though promised to us, is in the hands of the Gentiles. And they are the ones who oversee the process of whether or not you are quote-unquote Jew enough to be accepted here. There are some melanated groups that are living in Israel, but I tell you, they all live miserably and poorly, including the Phoenician. Suicide rate is at its highest with that particular group because of the persecution that they face from the people who now possess the land, who call themselves this.
Tekka's death wasn't the first to rally the Ethiopian-Israeli community. Over the past 5 years, 6 young Ethiopian men have been killed by cops, according to a local advocacy group, leading to huge protests across the country. None of the officers were prosecuted until now. This might sound a lot like the Black Lives Matter movement in America, but for Ethiopian Israelis, their struggle for acceptance is complicated by both race and religion. They're facing injustice in the world's only Jewish state, even though they're also Jewish.
We are not to regather ourselves as we discover who we are, because it was by divine power, through a curse, that removed us from the land, and it will take the same divine power through a blessing and prophecy that truly brings us back from the four corners of the earth. Not these paganistic Gentile governments who sign off on a piece of paper. This is why I personally do not tell people as they discover who they are to beckon and petition to go back to the land. There's a lot of evil things that has to come from Israel, or what they call Israel today. And believe you me, you don't want to be there when it's happening. But even before the Phoenicians of Ethiopia rose to prominence within the world stage, there was already a Hebrew presence in Ethiopia, stemming from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, who a lot of scholars say had a child named King Menelik. It is from this royal house that you get a man named Tafari. Now Tafari was the great-grandson of a man named Salih Selassie and a son of Prince Makonnen, or Ras Makonnen, which means prince. This is where you get the word Ras Tafari from. And the slaves who found themselves on the island of what we know now as Jamaica did a little bit of digging and trace a lot of their roots back to the same royal house of David, Beta Israel, and to the 12 tribes. Now you understand some of the symbology and the iconography dealing with the Lion of Judah and the Bob Marleys and the entire nine. This is where this is coming from.
It's been 40 days and nights in the wilderness, searching to find some peace and rest. I tell you, Israelite, we are gonna feel alright. We carry Rasta drum and then we carry Congo stand. I tell you, Israelite, we are gonna feel alright.
What are the other locations where remnants of the tribe of Dan can be found? And the answer is yes. Going back into the curses, we knew that we would be scattered amongst the Gentiles to live in their land. And because we were no longer in the promised land that promised protection, we would be persecuted in a lot of these places that we found ourselves in. We also understood that we were in exile of Yah. And when you get to the book of Galatians, Paul here is speaking as the same Paul who was mistaken for an Egyptian. He was speaking to the people of Galatia. The way you will pronounce Galatia in Hebrew is Galut Yah. And the word Galut means exile. And of course you have Y-A-H, Yah. Galut Yah. In exile of Yah is what Galatians means. This is who Paul was witnessing to. Now understand that in that territory known as Galatia, everyone living there was not a Hebrew Israelite in dispersion or in exile. The area later became known as Galatia simply because it seemed to house a lot of the tribes that were in actual exile of Yah. In the same way that in New York City, you have a place known as Little Italy. Why? Because in that small little section, there were a group of Italians who clung together. Does that mean that everyone in New York City is an Italian? No. Another case in point, again in New York City, you have a place known as Little China. For the same reason. Now does that mean that everyone in New York City is a Chinaman? No, it does not. If you need further proof biblically, and this is in the New Testament, that we knew that the tribes were scattered amongst the Gentiles. When you get into the book of James, this is the brother of the Messiah, by the way. He starts off his letters by saying, James, a servant of Yah, and the Lord Yahshua HaMashiach, to the 12 tribes scattered among the nations, greetings. You see, even back then, and this is after Yahshua had died and resurrected, we knew that our tribesmen were among the nations. And we didn't forget about them. We still wrote to them, among the Gentiles. Why? Because that's prophecy. In Isaiah chapter 11 verse 12, it says,
He shall raise a banner for the Gentiles, gather the scattered of Israel, and gather the scattered of Yahudah from the four corners of the earth.
When you look at this map here, you go all the way to the south of it, and Sidon is listed here as a coastal city. Again, that's the Phoenicians, where Dan was also located. They end up moving north, going past the top of Phoenicia into Syria. When you get into Syria, this area is now known as Asia Minor. Now, when you get to the book of Revelations, the 7 churches are located in this area. But I want you to focus on the area known as Galatia. This, at the time that Paul wrote to the people of Galatia, would have been a territory that housed some remnants of the northern tribes, which could have comprised a great deal of the Danites. But even before then, in the book of Ezekiel chapter 27 verse 19, we read that Dan also and Javan, going to and fro occupied in their affairs, brought iron, cassia, and calamus were in thy market. What you're reading is that Dan, the tribe of Dan, and Javan, which has been known to be the Greeks or the Hellenistic people, were in trade. When you hear about these European nations, it's typically dealing with trade. Solomon sent ships to Tarshish, which we know is Spain. You don't really read much about him witnessing to the people of Spain, but we see him trading there, or we see him gathering precious material, precious metal there. And the same can be said in Ezekiel. We don't read much about what Dan is doing with Javan or the people there, other than him going to and fro, being merchants on their ships, trading. We did business with the European nations. We didn't start to effectively witness to them until the time that Yahshua came, died, and resurrected. You have to go back and re-examine Yahshua's entire lifetime. His ministry only was in our promised land. He never set foot in Rome like Peter or Paul did. He never went to Athens or Greece or any of those places. As a matter of fact, he tells the disciples that he's only come for the scattered ones of Israel. Why? Because it starts with us. Then, before he ascends to his Father, he commands his disciples to go out amongst the nations of the Gentiles and to witness. Remember that we are to be the banner for the Gentiles, these other nations who do not know Yah. But see, the problem is that we don't know Yah either. And we don't know Yah because we don't know ourselves. And we no longer know ourselves because when we did, we didn't do our job. And that job is to serve Yah. We were to keep his commandments. And there was blessings that came with it, and there were curses that came from disobedience. And what route do you think we took? And in our absence of us not knowing who we are, others came and laid claim to the identity. But that is ending. But I'm going to get on it a little later. Let's keep tracking Dan. Now that we've tracked the tribe of Dan throughout Africa, how likely is it that Dan, with all of its seafaring knowledge as a tribe, could have made a voyage to the Europe continent and some of the British Isles? Well, it's highly likely. Just as Dan made their way throughout Africa and have influenced some of the tribes there, we do have good reason to believe that Dan may have in fact helped to influence some of these European tribes. Again, we know from Ezekiel that they were dealing with the Greeks among other nations of the European descent. But just because it is possible that Dan could have influenced a lot of these European tribes and maybe even settled there, does that make the European tribes now originally a part of the original tribe of Dan? No. Those lands were already inhabited by the Gentiles, the sons of Japheth, way before there was a Jacob, and way before Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes, which includes Dan. However, the Europeans have now spawned a concept known as British Israelism.
British Israelism, also called Anglo-Israelism, is the British nationalist, pseudo-archaeological, pseudo-historical one, and pseudo-religious two, belief that the people of Great Britain are genetically, racially, and linguistically the direct descendants of the 10 lost tribes of ancient Israel.
I want you to take note of that word pseudo, and let's find out what that word actually means. Here we read from the Oxford Languages that pseudo, not genuine, spurious, or a sham. When you look at the similarities, you get words like bogus, sham, phony, imitation, artificial, mock, and so forth. So we see it classified as pseudo-archaeological. That means there's little evidence within the earth to support this claim, because that's what archaeologists do. It's pseudo-historical because there's little historical record to validate that these European nations are actually the 10 tribes. And it's pseudo-religious because there isn't any book, including the Bible, that backs that up. As a matter of fact, if you read the Bible, it tells you exactly who these European nations are descendant from. Even down to these guys. They're known as the Ashkenaz. And you can read about the Ashkenaz in Genesis chapter 10 verse 3. As one of the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, Ripath, and Togarmah. Those are Gentiles from the son of Japheth. I know this is a lot of information, but everyone on this planet knows who they are, which means they know who you are. You're the only one who does not know. And because you don't know who you are, they can lay claim to that because you cannot contest it. But your Father's word lays it out plainly.
Hey, Daryl, just wanted to leave my testimony for you as a Gentile, believer in Yeshua HaMashiach, that I came to the understanding that the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade and probably some indigenous African Americans here that were here beforehand, I think might be some of the lost tribes of Israel who were here when Columbus got here, that understanding that you guys are the true Hebrew Israelites of the Bible that people around the world understand as descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. My testimony is about 3 years ago in December, I was reading the book of Revelation. As you know, it's the only book in the Bible that promises a blessing to those who read it, and it turned out to be true for me. I was in chapter 4 and verse 3, and he that sat on the throne was to look like a jasper and sardine stone, and there was a rainbow around the throne in the sight like unto an emerald. When I saw jasper and sardine stone, I looked those stones up, and the color of them was basically like a black man's skin. And then I turned back thinking of what Revelation 13 and 14, 1, 13 and 14 say. His head and hair were like wool. Of course, we know what African Americans' hair is like. It's like wool. White as snow. His eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet were like unto fine brass, as if it had been burned in a furnace. And so obviously we know what color that is. So that's when I realized that Jesus Christ was a black man. But I didn't put 2 and 2 together about his descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who the entire Old Testament and the New Testament, and Jesus speaks about it in Luke 21:24, that there's going to be a time period where the Gentiles take over, and at the end times, the Hebrew Israelites are going to wake up, they're going to come to themselves, they're going to remember who they are, and they're going to start coming back to Yah and his commands. And when they do, that is when the second Exodus takes place and Jesus' return happens. So it was a big, so I accepted that Jesus was black based on the Bible itself. And a little more about my story. I went to a fair, and recently after discovering this, and there was some IUIC gentlemen there in the purple and gold, and I almost had an opportunity to go up to him and say, I believe Jesus is black too. I didn't get the chance to speak to them, but I got home and I just looked up on YouTube, gold and purple, black Hebrews, and found somebody. I got his number, I called him, and because I wanted to fellowship with a Hebrew Israelite, and that was when I learned about the camp doctrine of white people can't be saved. It didn't deter me at all. In fact, later on, listening to some Hebrew Israelite teachers, I think Apostle Curtis Lewis brought this up, that Jesus himself said that many will be offended when they come to the realization their identity has been stolen from them. So I don't blame them at all. I think the teaching is wrong that Gentiles can't be saved, but I also think the teaching is wrong that it doesn't matter who the Hebrew Israelites are. It doesn't matter what color Jesus Christ's skin is, because it also says that in those later days and in that day and at that time, that people are going to see the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and know who they are based on their appearance. And many will come to the Jews and will say, I hear Yah is with you. And there will be 10 Gentiles to every one Jew who will grab the hem. And as we kind of enter into these times, understanding who the real Israelites are, I think it's more important than ever that Gentiles accept God's chosen people who were the Israelites, and that we got grafted in because of their unbelief, but don't boast against natural branches. I just think it's so important to take the Bible, the Word of God, seriously, and in most cases, just believe what it says. It always tells you if it's speaking in a parable or an allegory, but when it speaks outrightly and directly, I would just suggest that my fellow Gentiles take heed to what it says, and we can talk about this more when we talk on your podcast. But there's just a lot of great Bible teachers who teach the Bible in context that I don't think most of the Gentile churches are getting nowadays. The 501c3s that are real, maybe programmatic in their teaching style, where they'll just teach on a couple of verses and tell personal stories rather than really digging into the Bible. What does it say about the Hebrew Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the last days? What is the plan of redemption? Starts making sense of a lot of verses that we can talk about when I'm with you. But that's my testimony. I hope it helps, especially my fellow Gentiles, to understand that Israel matters. When you bless Israel, you are blessed. And so I just want to say, bless Israel, and we'll talk soon.
But back on the Europeans, there are a lot of people who believe that the country of Denmark, which ends up meaning something like Dan's mark, are of the tribe of Dan. There are a lot who believe that Scandinavians or Scandinavia are of the tribe of Dan. In Ireland, you have stories of the Tuatha De Danann, who a lot of Europeans say are remnants of the tribe of Dan. However, when you read about these Tuatha De Danann, which is Irish, the meaning has nothing to do with Dan. It literally means the folk of the goddess Danu. And they're known as a supernatural race in Irish mythology. One connection, however, I do see with how the Tuatha De Danann are portrayed is the serpent icon, which is and was used way back in Genesis to describe Dan. You have the famous river in Europe known as the Danube, which some European scholars associate with the tribe of Dan as well, and so forth and so forth. And as a result of these sparse findings, a lot of these countries now believe that the entire country is a tribe of Israel, specifically Dan. The Scandinavians believe this, the British believe this, the Irish believe this. And again, I am not saying that they would not have had contact with this lost tribe. For instance, the way to say David's name in Hebrew, yes, King David, would be Daoud. And when you look into the Irish iconography and the Irish linguistics, one of the common names in that part of the world is Daud. O'Dowd, McDowd, Dowden. Also, David is famous for playing a harp. Everywhere the tribes went, we would always speak on the renowned king. We still speak on King David today. David could play the harp so well that he could cast out evil spirits and demons in King Saul. Well, it just so happens that one of the icons of Ireland is a harp. David is from the tribe of Judah that is represented by a lion. It is interesting that while Europe has no lions on the continent, you see lions drawn on a lot of the European coat of arms. Again, could they have been contacted and influenced by some of these tribes? Yes. Does that make them one of the tribes? No. There was a point in time in history, in Europe specifically, where they wanted nothing to do with anything that had to do with Yahweh, keeping the commandments, keeping the Shabbat or the 7-day Sabbath. All of these European nations love pig and they love pork. All of these European nations love everything our Father's word tells us not to do. And they had been there since the days of Genesis. But now in Europe, it's becoming in vogue, stylish, cool even to now be able to associate oneself with one of these 12 tribes of Israel, even if the Europeans cling on to the worst tribe that made up the 12 tribes of Israel, which is the tribe of Dan. It's no different than how it is in America today, which is another little sister of Europe. There was a point in time in this country where no one wanted to be melanated. They did not want to look like us. They didn't want to sound like us. There were people who had what they call black in them, and they would hide that. They would perm their hair, they would bleach their skin, they would try to whitewash, they would speak differently, they would dress differently. It is said that Eisenhower, Hoover, Abraham Lincoln, and several others had black in them and did the utmost to conceal it. But now things have changed. There was a point in time in history where the blacks would make the music, and because you couldn't sell it to a white audience, a white artist would have to come and remake the same song, and several others. Why? Because just like in Europe, when it wasn't cool to be associated with the 12 tribes, here in America, it wasn't cool to be associated with a people who were cut off, known as the blacks, the Negroes. But now things are different. Instead of one bleaching their skin, most people are opting for tans. Instead of one trying to slim down and have less of a figure, most are going under the knife to get what all women naturally have. You are starting to see, just like the Bible says, that which was last shall become first, and that which was first shall become last. The truth of the matter is that Yah only chose one group of people to witness amongst the nations. That would include Europe. They are amongst the nations. Furthermore, in your free time, you're going to have to go and read the curses in Deuteronomy about the children of Israel and what would happen to us in our disobeying our Father and the original covenant. Ask yourself, do the Europeans fit that mold? Or were they instrumental in the slave trade? Countries like Britain, Scandinavia, Denmark, France, Italy, and so many more others. Ask yourself today, the Bible says the first shall become last and the last shall become first. Well, would you consider the European nations last in today's standard, or are they first? And if they're first, you have to consider who owns the world right now. This is Lucifer's world. The children of Yah, we're never going to be first in Lucifer's world. Not right now. But when Yahshua returns, the last shall become first and the first shall become last. Does that mean that Europeans and other Gentiles cannot receive salvation? No. Yahshua opened up the door to the Gentiles, but they first must admit that they are indeed Gentiles. And they know not who they worship, the same way that Yahshua told the Gentile woman at the well. For salvation is of the Yahudim, the true worshippers of Yah, the true Jews. And from these tribes will the world be witness unto about who we serve. And that cannot reach its full prophetic fulfillment until you wake up and find out who you are and what your job is. The beautiful part in all of this is that everyone else is doing their part. You know, in Leviticus chapter 5, verse 5, it says, when anyone becomes aware that they are guilty in any of these matters, they must confess in what they have sinned. And a lot of these Gentiles are telling you they were wrong. They lied. You are the children of Israel. Praise Yah. So we've covered Africa, Europe, and what about the Americas? Is it possible that the tribes, and specifically Dan, could have ventured to the Americas? Yes, absolutely. The Europeans would have you believe that before they crossed the seas, there was no culture in the world that had the technology and the capability of maritime travel at that distance. That simply is not true. The width of the Mediterranean Sea is actually wider than the width of the Atlantic Ocean, stretching from the western tip of Africa to the most eastern tip of South America. Which means that if we could travel the width of the Mediterranean, we could travel the width of the Atlantic. And we also know that there were already tribes living in what we now know as the Americas before Solomon sent out ships for trade. Was contact made? Of course. Could you trace maybe certain similarities and characteristics of the biblical Israelites with some of these Native American tribes? Absolutely. Does that make every Native American tribe Israel? No. The truth of the matter is, a lot of these Native American tribes were serpent worshippers, the same way we see in Ireland with the Tuatha Danann. In North America, you have the Mound people. The Ohio Valley is inundated with the mounds that they left behind as an indicator of their serpentine worship. You can go all the way down to Louisiana in a place known as New Iberia. There's a bayou called Tesh. And the Native Americans down there state that the bayou was created by a large serpent. When you get into Central and South America, you get the Mayans, the Incas, the Aztecs, and so forth. All of them had a deity of some sort that dealt with a flying serpent, a brazen serpent, or a winged serpent. Their pyramids, yes, the same pyramids that are traced back to Egypt, which are ultimately traced back to the towers of Babylon, deal with the veneration of the sun serpent coming down, reaching its height on the equinoxes. Natural inhabitants of this land were super steeped in this paganistic worship. Now you could better understand who Tupac or Marvel II was. No, not the rapper, the Peruvian rebel, who comes from the same area that we're speaking about. But since we mentioned the rapper, his name was not Tupac, it was Lassane Parish Crooks. His mother later on gave him that name. And the interesting part is that the Tupac or Marvel means shining serpent. Shakur's Arabic in it means thankful to God. You're thankful to God for your shining serpent is what the name means. What mother would give their son that name? Even so, on his death certificate, they still had to feature his original name. But I digress. Back on the tribe of Dan, in the next part, we will bring all of this to a head and answer the age-old question, why isn't the tribe of Dan listed in Revelations? Y'all bless.